January 17, 1945. Luzon Island, Philippines. The monsoon rains had softened the earth into red-brown mud that clung to boots and vehicle treads alike. In the detention compound established by the advancing American forces, a young woman sat on a wooden crate beneath a canvas top stretched between bamboo poles. Her name was Akiko Yamamoto, a civilian nurse attached to the Imperial Japanese Army, and in her lap she held a photograph she had not seen in 3 years. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from something she had no vocabulary to describe. The image showed her mother standing before their family home in Osaka, cherry blossoms suspended in full bloom behind her. An American corporal, barely 20 years old himself, had placed it there an hour earlier without ceremony, without demand, without the expectation of gratitude. He had simply said, through a Nisei interpreter, "We found this in the hospital records. Thought you might want it back." Then he walked away. She stared at the photograph until the light began to fail, until the distinction between memory and paper blurred entirely. Around her, other women, nurses, teachers, communications clerks, held similar artifacts of interrupted lives. They did not speak. They did not need to. Each woman understood that something fundamental had shifted, that the architecture of everything they had been taught about the enemy, about the war, about the inevitable choice between death and dishonor, had revealed a door they had not known existed. This was not supposed to happen. The Pacific War had been characterized, from its earliest moments, by a particular species of brutality that even hardened observers found difficult to comprehend. The ideological chasm between Imperial Japan and the Allied powers, particularly the United States, was not merely political or strategic, it was cosmological. The Japanese military apparatus operated within a framework of Bushido mythology adapted for industrial warfare, a code that transformed surrender into spiritual annihilation and painted capture as a fate literally worse than death. Women who found themselves in military or quasi-military roles understood this doctrine with special clarity. They had been told repeatedly what American soldiers would do to captured Japanese women. The stories were lurid, specific, and officially sanctioned. Rape, torture, mutilation, these were not presented as possibilities but as certainties, as inevitable as gravity. When the American forces began their reconquest of the Philippines in October 1944, Japanese civilians and military personnel attached to the occupation forces faced an impossible calculus. The official directive was unambiguous: avoid capture at all costs. For women, this often meant something even more absolute. Documents recovered after the war revealed that nursing staff and female civilian employees attached to military hospitals were issued cyanide capsules or small-caliber pistols with single rounds. The message was clear without being explicit. Some commanders did not bother with subtlety. Captain Yoshiko Hasegawa, head nurse at a field hospital in Leyte, recorded in her diary, later recovered by American intelligence, that her commanding officer told the nursing staff directly, "If the Americans come, use these. Do not allow yourselves to be taken. The shame would extend beyond your lives and corrupt your families for generations." This was the mental landscape Akiko Yamamoto and thousands of women like her inhabited as American forces closed in on their positions throughout late 1944 and early 1945. They expected annihilation. They had been trained to expect it, conditioned to accept it, and psychologically fortified to enact their own destruction rather than permit capture. When that capture came anyway, through circumstance, injury, or the simple chaos of collapsing military lines, they waited for the horrors they had been promised. The horrors did not arrive. Instead, something more disturbing occurred: normalcy, medical care, food, and then, inexplicably, photographs. To understand the magnitude of this gesture, the return of personal photographs to prisoners of war requires understanding what had been lost and what the recovery represented. When American forces overran Japanese military installations, hospitals, and administrative centers, they encountered vast quantities of paperwork. The Imperial Japanese military was, if nothing else, meticulous in its record-keeping. Personnel files, medical records, supply inventories, communications logs, all maintained with bureaucratic precision even as the empire crumbled. Embedded within these files were personal effects, identity photographs, family pictures carried as talismans, images of children and parents tucked into official folders. Standard wartime protocol among most armies would have been to inventory these items, possibly use them for intelligence purposes, and then warehouse or destroy them. Personal effects of enemy personnel held minimal military value. They were, in the brutal arithmetic of war, irrelevant. But in dozens of detention camps across the newly liberated Philippines, something different happened. American personnel, often junior officers and enlisted men tasked with organizing captured materials, began the laborious process of matching photographs to prisoners. They cross-referenced names, checked handwriting on photo backs, consulted with interpreters, and physically walked through detention compounds to reunite women with images of their families. There was no directive for this. No official policy mandated it. It emerged organically from the same cultural instinct that had American soldiers sharing chocolate with enemy children and medics treating wounded Japanese soldiers with the same care as American casualties. Lieutenant Margaret Stevenson, an Army Nurse Corps officer who worked in the detention facility at San Fernando, Pampanga, documented the phenomenon in letters to her sister in Ohio. "The Japanese nurses don't know what to make of us," she wrote in February 1945. "They were told we would abuse them, kill them, worse. Instead, our boys are giving them back pictures of their mothers." I watched one sergeant spend 2 hours trying to identify the owner of a photograph of 2 little girls. He finally found her, a quiet woman who couldn't have been more than 25. When he handed it to her, she didn't cry, didn't thank him, just held it and stared like she was holding something holy. I think, in a way, she was. The psychological impact of this gesture cannot be overstated. These women had been conditioned to view Americans as fundamentally barbaric, as racial inferiors driven by base instincts and lacking the spiritual refinement of the Japanese. This was not casual propaganda but core curriculum in both civilian and military education. The return of something as intimate as a family photograph, an acknowledgement that these prisoners were daughters, sisters, mothers, people with interior lives and connections that preceded and transcended the war, struck at the foundation of that ideology. Michiko Nokohara, a communications specialist who had been attached to the 14th Area Army Headquarters in Manila, was captured when the city fell in March 1945. In interviews conducted decades later for the Japanese National Diet Library's Oral History Project, she recalled the moment an American soldier returned her photograph with startling clarity. "I had a picture of my father," she said. "He was a literature professor before the war. In the photograph, he was standing in his study, surrounded by books. When Manila was falling, I burned most of my personal items because we had been told the Americans would use them to mock us, to humiliate us. But this one photograph was in my official file, attached to my personnel record. I thought it was lost forever." An American private, I remember he had red hair, which I had never seen before, came to me 3 weeks after my capture. He had the photograph in a clean envelope. He handed it to me and said something I didn't understand. The interpreter told me, he said, "Your father looks like a wise man." That was all. I tried to return it, because I thought there must be some mistake, some trick. But he just shook his head and walked away. I held that photograph every day for the rest of my captivity. I couldn't reconcile what I had been taught with what I was experiencing. The dissonance was almost painful. This dissonance, the cognitive rupture between expectation and reality, was the intended outcome of American detention camp policy in the Pacific Theater, though perhaps not in the way military planners had initially conceived it. The treatment of prisoners of war, particularly Japanese prisoners, had become a strategic concern for Allied leadership by mid-1944. The fanatical resistance demonstrated by Japanese forces, the prevalence of suicide attacks, and the extremely low surrender rates indicated that Japanese military personnel viewed capture as a terminal state, a point beyond which life had no meaning. This created both tactical and humanitarian problems. Tactically, it meant Japanese forces fought to absolute annihilation, resulting in higher casualties on both sides. Humanely, it meant that when Japanese personnel were captured, often wounded, unconscious, or trapped, they expected immediate execution and behaved accordingly. The American response evolved throughout the war. Initial treatment of Japanese prisoners was professional but cold, guided by Geneva Convention minimums. But as the number of prisoners increased, and as military intelligence recognized the propaganda value of humane treatment, policy began to shift. By 1945, detention facilities in the Pacific were explicitly instructed to exceed minimum standards, to demonstrate through material action that surrender to American forces did not mean death, dishonor, or torture. For female prisoners, this policy took on additional dimensions. The number of Japanese women in military or quasi-military roles had increased dramatically as the war progressed and as male casualties mounted. By 1945, women served as nurses, communications operators, clerks, translators, and even in civil defense roles in occupied territories. When these women were captured, American forces faced a unique challenge: how to demonstrate humanity toward individuals who had been specifically and systematically terrorized about the consequences of capture. The return of personal photographs became part of this unspoken protocol. It cost nothing in material terms. The photographs were already in American hands, already inventoried as part of captured enemy records. But the symbolic weight was enormous. A photograph is not merely an image. It is a physical manifestation of memory, a bridge between the present and the past, a tangible link to identity that exists independent of the war. To return such an object to a prisoner was to acknowledge that person's existence beyond their role as enemy combatant. It was to say, without words, you were someone before this war, and you will be someone after it. The women who experienced this gesture struggled to process it within the framework they had been given. Keiko Tanaka, a nurse captured on Luzon, described the experience in testimony given to American occupation authorities in 1946. "We thought Americans were demons," she said through an interpreter. "That is not poetry or exaggeration. We believed you were literally not fully human. When I was given medical care for my injuries, when I was given food, when I was given a blanket, each thing was a small shock. But when a soldier brought me a photograph of my sister, a photograph I had forgotten was even in my personnel file, I realized that everything I had been taught was a lie. Not incorrect, but a deliberate lie. That realization was more painful than my wounds." This pain, the pain of ideological collapse, appears repeatedly in testimonies and memoirs written by Japanese prisoners of war. The immediate relief of not being executed or abused was often followed by a deeper crisis. If the Americans were not the demons they had been portrayed as, what did that mean about the war itself? What did it mean about the sacrifices made, the atrocities witnessed or participated in, the entire structure of meaning that had organized their lives for years? Some women retreated into silence, unable or unwilling to confront these questions while still in captivity. Others began the slow process of reconstruction, allowing their observations of American behavior to gradually overwrite their indoctrination. The photograph became, for many, a physical anchor for this process. It was proof that the Americans saw them as humans, yes, but also proof that they themselves had existed before the war's ideological machinery had reshaped them. The photograph predated the propaganda. It was evidence of a prior self. Yuki Fujimoto, a teacher who had been conscripted to work in a military communication center in Manila, kept a secret journal during her captivity, a violation of camp rules, but one she felt compelled to commit. Excerpts from this journal, published in a Japanese historical anthology in 1987, reveal the internal struggle with striking clarity. "Today marks 3 months since capture," she wrote in June 1945. "I have a photograph of my students, taken in 1941 before the war consumed everything. An American lieutenant found it among school records they captured and brought it to me personally. He asked, through the interpreter, if I had been a teacher. When I confirmed this, he said, 'My mother is a teacher too.' That was the entire conversation. But I cannot stop thinking about it. He had a mother who was a teacher. He thought this fact was worth sharing with an enemy prisoner. In what universe does such a thing happen? Not the universe I was taught to believe in." The symbolic resonance of the photograph extended beyond individual healing. In the collective experience of female Japanese prisoners, the return of these images became a shared language for discussing the undiscussable. The possibility that they had been catastrophically misled about the nature of the enemy and the war. Women who might not discuss politics or strategy directly could show each other their returned photographs, could share the stories of how they had been delivered, could begin to construct an alternative narrative about American soldiers based on observed behavior rather than propaganda. This was particularly significant given the isolation these women faced. Unlike male prisoners of war, who were often held in larger groups and could maintain some semblance of military structure and collective identity, female prisoners were typically held in smaller facilities, often integrated with civilian internees or separated into small groups based on their military specialties. This isolation could be psychologically devastating, but it also created space for ideological reorientation. Without the pressure to maintain group loyalty to imperial doctrine, individual women could allow their observations to reshape their understanding. Captain Susan Morrison, a Women's Army Corps officer who served as liaison to female prisoner facilities in Manila, noted this phenomenon in her official reports. The Japanese military nurses and civilian personnel display a remarkable capacity for cognitive adjustment, she wrote in April 1945. Initial contact is characterized by extreme fear and often suicidal ideation. However, once they observe that they will not be harmed, that they will receive medical care and adequate nutrition, and particularly when they are treated with basic human dignity, their psychological state improves rapidly. The return of personal effects, particularly photographs, accelerates this process significantly. One prisoner, a nurse named Haruko, told our interpreter that receiving her photograph of her mother was the first true thing that had happened to her since the war began. "I'm still contemplating what she meant by true thing, but I believe it relates to a return to civilian identity and a rejection of the military ideological framework." The concept of the true thing that Captain Morrison noted is crucial to understanding the deeper significance of this phenomenon. In the totalizing environment of imperial Japanese military culture, particularly as the war situation deteriorated, truth became increasingly plastic. Victories were announced that had never occurred. Strategic retreats were described as tactical repositioning. Imminent defeat was portrayed as approaching triumph. Women serving in military capacities were not insulated from this distortion. Indeed, they were often specifically targeted with false information designed to maintain morale and suppress dissent. In this context, a photograph was radically, undeniably true. It depicted an actual moment, an actual person, an actual relationship. It could not be reinterpreted or propagandized. It simply was. When American soldiers returned these photographs, they were returning more than personal mementos. They were returning the concept of objective truth itself. This interpretation may seem grandiose, but it aligns with testimonies provided by dozens of former prisoners in the decades after the war. Tomoko Ishikawa, a radio operator captured in April 1945, explicitly made this connection in a 1978 interview. "The photograph my American captor returned to me showed my brother in his university uniform," she said. "He died in Burma in 1944. When I looked at that photograph, which I had not seen since being deployed to the Philippines, I realized that the Americans did not need to give this to me. They could have destroyed it, kept it, ignored it. The fact that they took the time to return it meant they operated under different rules than I had been taught. It meant that truth, the truth of my brother's existence, the truth of my connection to him, mattered to them. If that was true, then what else might be true? If they respected the truth of a photograph, perhaps they also respected other truths I had been told they rejected. Perhaps the stories about atrocities were exaggerated. Perhaps the whole war was built on different foundations than I had been told." The cascade of doubt this initiated was precisely what Allied psychological warfare specialists had hoped to achieve, though the specific mechanism, the return of photographs, was never part of any formal strategy. It emerged from the ground level, from individual acts of decency by American servicemen who saw captured enemy personnel as people rather than abstractions. Private First Class Robert Chen, a Nisei soldier who served as an interpreter in the Manila detention facilities, reflected on this in a 1992 oral history interview for the Veterans History Project. "A lot of the guys didn't think about it strategically," he said. "They just saw these women who were scared out of their minds, and they wanted to help somehow. Giving them back pictures of their families was easy. It didn't cost anything. But you could see the effect immediately. The fear would drain out of their faces. They'd look at the picture, then at the soldier who gave it to them, then back at the picture, like they were trying to reconcile two different realities. Some of the women would cry, but quietly. Others would just stare. But you could see something change. They'd been told we were monsters. A monster doesn't give you back a picture of your mother. That simple act opened a door." The door Private Chen described led to a broader transformation in how these women understood not just Americans but the entire ideological structure of the war. If the enemy was not what they had been told, if American soldiers demonstrated capacity for mercy and recognition of shared humanity, then the moral certainty that had underwritten Japanese military conduct became unstable. Acts that had been justified by the absolute evil of the enemy became harder to rationalize. Sacrifices that had seemed necessary in the face of monstrous opponents became tragic and possibly avoidable. This psychological transformation had practical implications as well. Female prisoners who experienced humane treatment became more willing to cooperate with camp authorities, more likely to provide useful intelligence about Japanese military dispositions and strategy, and more willing to participate in propaganda broadcasts aimed at encouraging other Japanese personnel to surrender. The ethical complexity of this outcome troubled some American observers even at the time. Was it moral to treat prisoners humanely in part because that treatment made them more useful intelligence sources? Did the propaganda value of humane treatment compromise the genuine decency that motivated it? These questions were debated in after-action reports and policy documents, but they seemed less relevant to the women experiencing the treatment. For them, the motivation behind the kindness mattered less than the fact of its existence. Whether Americans returned photographs because of basic decency or strategic calculation, the photographs were still returned. The gesture was still real. And the photographs themselves became more than memory aids. They became evidence that could be weighed against years of propaganda. When Hanako Soto, a civilian accountant attached to a military logistics unit, was given a photograph of her two sons, ages 5 and 7 when the picture was taken in 1942, she began showing it to other prisoners, explaining each time how an American sergeant had delivered it personally, how he had made sure it was the right photograph for the right person, how he had smiled when she nodded in confirmation. The photograph became both personal treasure and political document, proof that the world was not as they had been told. By July 1945, as the war ground toward its atomic conclusion, the American detention facilities in the Philippines held several thousand Japanese prisoners, including approximately 800 women in various military and civilian capacities. The vast majority had been captured in the first 7 months of the year as American forces completed the liberation of the archipelago. Among these women, the practice of returning personal photographs had become well known. New arrivals would often ask, through interpreters, if they might receive their photographs back. The question itself represented a profound shift. These women had expected death or worse. Instead, they were asking for photographs. The symbolic object of the returned photograph accumulated meaning through repetition. Each woman who received one told others. Each telling reinforced the cognitive dissonance between expectation and reality. The photograph became shorthand for a complex set of observations. Americans provide medical care. Americans provide adequate food. Americans do not torture prisoners. Americans return photographs. Each observation was small, but collectively they constructed an alternative narrative about the enemy that contradicted years of indoctrination. Lieutenant Colonel Peter Davidson, who oversaw several detention facilities in Luzon, attempted to quantify this phenomenon in a report to higher headquarters in August 1945. The return of personal effects, particularly photographs, to Japanese prisoners appears to have significant impact on prisoner morale and cooperation, he wrote. Prisoners who have received personal photographs demonstrate reduced suicide risk, increased willingness to comply with camp regulations, and greater receptivity to information contradicting Japanese military propaganda. While difficult to measure precisely, the psychological value of this practice appears to far exceed the minimal administrative burden it requires. Recommend continuation and expansion of personal effects return protocols. The recommendation was overtaken by events. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. The women in American detention facilities heard this broadcast in various states of comprehension. Some refused to believe it. Some had expected it. Others had stopped trying to predict or understand the war's trajectory and simply focused on surviving each day. But for virtually all of them, the surrender meant confronting an unexpected future. They had expected to die. They had been captured instead. They had expected abuse. They had been treated humanely instead. And now they would return to a Japan that no longer existed in the form they remembered. The photographs they carried with them, returned by American soldiers against all expectation, became bridges across this temporal and psychological chasm. The Japan in the photographs was a Japan before the war's ideological machinery had fully consumed everything, before total mobilization, before the absolute certainty of victory or honorable death. The photographs depicted normal life, civilian life, life organized around family and work and seasonal celebrations rather than military necessity and imperial destiny. In the months after the surrender, as repatriation slowly proceeded, these photographs took on additional meaning. Many women returned to cities that had been firebombed into ruin, to families fragmented by death and displacement, to a social structure that viewed surrender as dishonor regardless of circumstances. The photograph, physical proof of a life before the war, became evidence that return was possible, that identity could survive catastrophe, that the person in the photograph and the person holding it were connected despite everything that had happened between. Akiko Yamamoto, the young nurse who had been given back her photograph of her mother in January 1945, returned to Osaka in November of that year. Her family home had been destroyed in the firebombing of March 1945. Her mother had survived and was living with relatives in the countryside. When Akiko found her and presented the photograph an American soldier had returned to her, her mother wept. Not because the photograph itself was precious, though it was, but because its existence meant that Akiko had been treated as a human being by the enemy. It meant that the worst fears had not been realized. It meant that perhaps the future was not as irredeemably dark as it seemed in those first months of occupation. Akiko kept that photograph for the rest of her life. In a 1994 interview conducted for a documentary on women's experiences in the Pacific War, she said, "I think about that American corporal sometimes. I never learned his name. He was so young, probably no older than I was. He handed me the photograph and walked away like it was nothing, like returning a family picture to an enemy prisoner was the most natural thing in the world. Maybe for him it was. But for me, it was the moment I understood that I would live, that life after capture was possible, that the world was different than I had been taught. That photograph, that single gesture, probably saved my life. Not physically, but spiritually. It gave me a reason to keep existing when I had been prepared not to." The gesture she described, simple, unheralded, requiring only basic human decency, was replicated thousands of times across the Pacific theater in the war's final year. It was never policy in the formal sense, never captured in field manuals or strategic directives. It emerged from the ground level, from individual soldiers who recognized that the person standing before them, regardless of uniform or nationality, was someone's daughter, someone's mother, someone who had been loved and photographed and remembered. This recognition stands in profound contrast to the dehumanizing logic that characterized much of the Pacific War. The conflict had been marked by racial animosity, by mutual atrocities, by a level of brutality that shocked even veterans of the European theater. Yet within this maelstrom of violence, ordinary American soldiers, farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit and college students from California, repeatedly demonstrated capacity for mercy and recognition of shared humanity. The return of photographs to Japanese prisoners was one manifestation of this capacity, perhaps uniquely powerful because of its symbolic resonance. A photograph is not food or medicine or shelter, practical necessities that even purely self-interested captors might provide. A photograph serves no military or logistical purpose. Its return is purely an act of recognition, an acknowledgement that the person receiving it has an interior life, a history, connections that matter. In returning these photographs, American soldiers were saying, "I see you not as the enemy, not as a statistic, but as a person whose mother's image means something, whose children's faces deserve to be remembered, whose life extends beyond this moment of capture and detention." This seeing, this fundamental recognition, is perhaps the most profound form of ideological warfare, though it was never conceived as such. It undermined the Japanese military's indoctrination not through counter-propaganda or psychological operations programs, but through direct experimental contradiction. Women who had been taught that Americans were racial inferiors, that they were rapacious and cruel and fundamentally other, found themselves receiving photographs from enemy soldiers who demonstrated care and consideration. The dissonance could not be ignored or rationalized away. It demanded a restructuring of understanding. The restructuring was painful. It meant acknowledging that the war they had supported or participated in was built on foundations of lies. It meant recognizing that suffering and sacrifice had been extracted based on false premises. It meant confronting the possibility that the atrocities committed by Japanese forces, and they were extensive and horrific, had been enabled by the same propaganda structure that had portrayed Americans as monsters. Not all women who received photographs came to this realization, or came to it completely. Some maintained their loyalty to imperial ideology even in the face of contradictory evidence. Some simply compartmentalized, allowing that individual American soldiers could be kind while maintaining that America as a nation and military force remained the enemy. But for many, the photograph became the crack through which doubt entered and eventually reshaped everything. In the broader history of the Pacific War, these individual moments of photograph return may seem like footnotes, minor incidents in a conflict of massive scale and consequence. But for the women who experienced them, they were transformative. They represent a peculiar form of American power that existed alongside and sometimes in tension with the military might that won the war. The power of ordinary decency, of small gestures that acknowledged shared humanity, of practical idealism that manifested in returning a photograph to someone who never expected to see it again. This power, more cultural than military, more implicit than designed, would become a defining characteristic of American influence in the post-war order. The same country that firebombed Japanese cities also returned photographs to prisoners. The same military that deployed atomic weapons also made sure captured nurses got pictures of their children back. The contradiction is jarring, but it reflects a genuine duality in American conduct during the war, capable of devastating industrial violence in service of victory, but also capable of individual acts of mercy that recognize the humanity of the enemy. The women who experienced this duality, who survived the war and carried their returned photographs into the occupation and Reconstruction period, became inadvertent witnesses to a truth about power and culture that would shape the next 70 years of history. America's influence in the post-war world was built not just on military and economic dominance, but on millions of small interactions that suggested, sometimes truthfully, sometimes not, that individual human dignity mattered, that even in war there were limits, that the adversary could be defeated without being dehumanized. The returned photograph, carried by a former prisoner across the Pacific to a destroyed homeland and held onto through decades of reconstruction and memory, stands as artifact and symbol of this complex legacy. It represents both the horror and the hope of those years, both the violence that made the capture necessary and the humanity that made the return possible. It asks uncomfortable questions about why such small mercies seem notable, why the basic decency of returning a photograph to its owner becomes remarkable in the context of war. But it also provides uncomfortable answers. In a conflict that reduced millions of people to statistics, targets, and abstractions, the return of a photograph, one face, one connection to a life outside the war, represented an insistence that the person holding it was real, that her grief and fear and memory mattered, that she would exist beyond this moment of defeat and captivity. For the women who received these photographs from American soldiers in the final months of the Pacific War, that insistence became the foundation for survival. It meant they were not merely defeated enemies but human beings who would return to families, rebuild lives, and carry forward complicated memories of the war and its aftermath. The photograph in their hands, creased, faded, carried through chaos, was proof that such return was possible, that identity persisted even when everything else had been destroyed. Years later, decades later, some of these women would tell their stories. They would explain, haltingly, through translators or in carefully practiced English, what it meant to be given back a photograph when they expected only death. They would describe the cognitive whiplash of confronting kindness from the enemy. They would acknowledge the profound destabilization that came from realizing that everything they had been taught was incomplete or false. And they would show the photographs themselves, now even more faded, protected in albums or frames, treasured not just for what they depicted but for what their return had represented. An American soldier's capacity to see an enemy prisoner as someone's daughter, and to act on that recognition without expectation of reward or recognition. That gesture, small, unremarked, repeated thousands of times in detention camps across the Pacific, was its own form of victory. Not military victory, but ideological victory. It demonstrated, more effectively than any propaganda campaign could, that the American conception of human dignity was genuine enough to extend even to captured enemies in the midst of total war. It suggested that democracy and its attendant respect for individual humanity were not merely strategic conveniences but actual values that manifested in practical action. The Japanese women who experienced this suggestion, who tested it against their own observations and found it largely reliable, became witnesses to a proposition they had been taught was impossible. That the enemy could be powerful without being monstrous, that defeat did not require dishonor, that survival as a prisoner could be the beginning of life rather than its ending. The photograph they held, returned by an American soldier who understood, instinctively or consciously, that it mattered, was evidence of this impossible proposition. It was a bridge between what they had been taught and what they had experienced, between the war's brutal logic and the possibility of something beyond it. In the end, perhaps, this is what photographs always are, evidence that a moment existed, that people and places and connections were real despite everything that comes after. When American soldiers returned these photographs to Japanese prisoners, they were returning more than images. They were returning the possibility of continuity, of identity that survived catastrophe, of truth that could be held in two hands and contemplated even as the world burned. For the women who received them, who kept them through repatriation and reconstruction and long decades of memory, those photographs became testament to the most confounding truth of all. That kindness, like cruelty, is a choice, and that even in war's darkest hours, some people choose mercy.